Welcome to True Crime Log, where every case cuts deep. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and step with me into the dark. Chris Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in the quiet town of Spring Lake, North Carolina, a place where the rhythm of life seemed slow, ordinary, and steady. The youngest in his family, he was raised alongside his sister, Jamie, by his parents, Ronnie and Cindy Watts. From the very beginning, Chris exhibited a quiet, introspective nature. He wasn't the child who commanded attention with laughter or rebellion. He observed. He listened. He absorbed the world around him with a measured calm that often left others curious, sometimes frustrated, and sometimes admiring. His parents offered a household of contrasts. Ronnie, his father, was a figure of steady authority and a model of work ethic. He instilled discipline and responsibility early, valuing consistency and reliability in his children. Chris looked up to him, modeling his own behavior on the example he provided. Cindy, his mother, maintained a firm hand over the household, a presence that some later described as emotionally distant, critical, and occasionally controlling. These dynamics created the foundation for Chris's early understanding of relationships. Structure, obedience, and observation were rewarded, while emotional openness was muted. School became a quiet refuge for Chris, a place where he could excel without drawing undue attention. Teachers remembered him as polite, attentive, and academically competent. Friends described a boy who rarely spoke out of turn, yet who often displayed subtle brilliance, particularly in technical or mechanical pursuits.
My name is Chris Watts. I'm doing my communication speech for Brenda Armentrout, and welcome to Broomfield, Colorado. About 70 degrees, and it's awesome outside, so welcome. I'm doing my speech on relationship deterioration and repair, and this is my PowerPoint to help me. Deterioration. The relationship begins to fall apart, crumble, or fail. You have weakening bonds. You get bored of the everyday routine, and you get distractions such as work, hobbies, relationships, no matter how harmless, even at the job. You might meet a new person, and it could strengthen into something else, and could weaken the bond you have with the partner you have. You spend less time with each other, and sometimes you have no time to maintain the relationship. Sometimes in a relationship, you maybe make promises that can turn into a major betrayal, or minor arguments that could turn into things where you can say spiteful comments, which turn into bigger problems. The first phase of deterioration is interpersonal dissatisfaction, which when you become unhappy with all the everyday interactions with you and your partner. You also begin to view your future with your partner as a negative future. And the second phase is interpersonal deterioration, which you start to grow farther and farther apart. And you share less of your free time with each other. You have more awkward silences at dinner, or when you're just out by yourself, you don't talk at all. You disclose less of your feelings, and you show less affection toward each other. When you have good communication, you show more nonverbal communication, which is the majority of the messages we send, like through gestures, facial expressions, eye contact, the tone of your voice. And there's many types of forms of communication these days, and it's the most successful groundwork for relationships. A few quotes that I've done research on from Elaine Schemberg: all relationships problems stem from poor communication skills, which is very true. And another quote from Schemberg and Sorjan: you can't communicate while you're checking your BlackBerry, watching TV, or flipping through sports section, which is very true. With technology nowadays, you'll be on your iPhone, your BlackBerry, at a restaurant, and you'll see two people at a table, and you'll see both of them on their phones, either Facebook comment, status, or maybe playing a game, and there's no communication at all. Commitment is the degree of commitment affects your relationship. According to Hirofumi, Not surprisingly, commitment is especially strong when individuals are satisfied with their relationship and grows weaker as individuals become less satisfied. You have to ask yourself 3 questions when you're in a relationship. Do I have a desire to keep this relationship going? Do I have a moral obligation to stay in this relationship? Or is it a necessity for me to stay in this relationship? According to my research, sometimes a necessity could be children. Sometimes when you have children and your relationship starts to deteriorate, a child could help repair it. All relationships are held together in part by a form of commitment, either based on desire, obligation, or necessity. And when the commitment is strong enough to hold the relationship together, you avoid arguing about minor disagreements and you support one another. When commitment is weak, the relationship is full of doubt and the relationship deteriorates faster. You have 2 types of deterioration. You have sudden and you have gradual. Sudden would be an example of infidelity. When somebody is not faithful to their partner, the partners realize that the relationship cannot be sustained. Gradual would be if you met somebody at work or a new friendship has occurred and as it goes on, you see that, okay, maybe this relationship has more potential than the relationship I have with my partner. And that would gradually push the old relationship out and push the new relationship in. Reasons relationships start to fall apart. Sometimes you no longer find your partner attractive, physically or in their personality. When you're in a relationship, you have to show desire, lust towards your partner. Sometimes when you get married, that the lust and the desire kind of falls by the wayside a little bit. But if you want your relationship to keep going, I would suggest maybe go to a place where you first met, or go bungee jumping, go somewhere that will bring the excitement back. You no longer experience closeness, or when your differences become more important than the similarities, you just pick apart your partner and you don't see anything that you have in common anymore. You just see something he or she does and it just gets on your nerves and you just can't let that go. And you feel you might do better with someone else that you've met. You think that you can no longer that your partner is someone that you can't be with. When you feel you're putting more into the relationship than you are getting out. According to Bloomstein and Schwartz, when a relationship breaks up, it's generally the more attractive one that leaves, which I agree with somewhat and then I disagree with. When in repair, the stage is not always pursued. Sometimes people, when the relationship starts to dissolve, repair is not an option and they want to get away and start new. When you want to go into repair, you need to analyze what went wrong and consider what ways of solving the problems. You need to consider changing your behavior or perhaps changing your expectations for your partner. And you might also want to evaluate how you could feel in the relationship and if it had ended. One of the first stages of repair you need to recognize, identify the problem. What changes you need to make the relationship better. Avoid words like always and never. If you say this to your partner, it just makes the relationship makes it backtrack. You'll never get to the repair stage. You need to take responsibility for your feelings and not blame your partner. And you need to be descriptive when discussing grievances. Resolution and conflict resolution. You need to look closely for relational messages that will help clarify motivations and needs. Exchange perspectives and see the situation as your partner does. You need to own your own feelings and thoughts. Use active listening techniques. Listen to your partner. Make sure they feel wanted. Make sure that they know that you're there and not in space somewhere thinking about the baseball game that's coming up or the football game that's coming up, which I sometimes do. Think clearly before saying things you may later forget. Don't just blurt out something. Just think about it. Don't just, if something comes to your mind, then it might be wrong. I do that too. And keep channels of communication open. Always disclose your feelings. Don't keep things bottled up because it will later come back to bite you. Possible solutions. Discuss solutions that both you and your partner win. Don't have a win-lose solution. The win-lose solution, sometimes when somebody loses, you'll have hostility and you'll have resentment. Sometimes they may not show it, but they will be thinking it. And to affirm each other. Support each other, positive evaluations, positive feelings. Always disclose your feelings, as I said. And cherish the gestures. It's a smile, a wink, a kiss, maybe just a hug, anything at all. Solutions into normal behavior. Say you're sorry. Sometimes it takes a lot to admit that just to say you're sorry, but it helps. Risk rejection by making the first move. Be willing to change, to adapt, to take a new task and responsibility. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that relationships are hard, but they're worth it in the end. And as the Swedish proverb says, a double joy is a shared joy, and a double sorrow is not a shared sorrow. Thank you.
Chris had a natural aptitude for understanding how things worked, whether it was the inner workings of a car engine or the logical progression of a complex problem. This analytical mind, paired with a reserved demeanor, became a defining trait of his youth. Sports and extracurricular activities played a role, but not in the way they did for many teenagers. Chris participated, but he never sought the spotlight. Instead, he gravitated toward activities that required focus, precision, and technical skill. Friends later recalled his attention to detail and his methodical approach. A young man quietly perfecting his craft, laying the groundwork for a future built on control and order. Home life, while superficially normal, contained subtle complexities. Some neighbors and friends would later describe Chris as deeply private, a boy who internalized conflict rather than expressing it outwardly. Small family tensions, financial stress, or unspoken disagreements shaped his perception of the world. He learned early that feelings could be hidden, that appearances mattered, and that emotions were to be measured, not displayed recklessly. It was in these formative years that he began to compartmentalize, a skill that would later manifest in both his career and, tragically, in his adult life. By the time he reached high school, Chris had begun to cultivate the life patterns that would define his early adulthood. Academically, he thrived. Technically, he excelled. Socially, he remained reserved, carefully managing his interactions, cultivating a small circle of trusted friends, and maintaining a reputation as polite, steady, and reliable. He was, in many ways, a boy who would grow into a man whose life seemed ordinary to everyone around him, an image that would later mask extraordinary darkness. After graduation, Chris pursued a technical education, moving into trade school to hone skills in mechanical work and engineering. Living away from home, he embraced independence, navigating shared housing with roommates while balancing work and school. He held jobs at car dealerships and repair shops, where his precision, reliability, and steady demeanor made him an asset. He was recognized as intelligent, capable, and disciplined, a man who could follow complex processes, manage responsibility, and maintain focus under pressure. Yet the quiet exterior concealed a developing complexity. Chris learned to internalize emotions, to suppress vulnerability, and to channel ambition and dissatisfaction into private thought rather than action. Friends later noted that he rarely shared his frustrations, rarely revealed deep feelings, and often presented an image of composure even in the face of conflict. These were traits that would serve him well professionally, and yet they also created the inner architecture of a personality capable of detachment and rationalization. Characteristics that, when combined with future circumstances, would have tragic consequences. His early life, rooted in routine, discipline, and emotional control, also exposed subtle vulnerabilities. A desire for recognition, a yearning for autonomy, and a restless curiosity for life beyond predictable boundaries. These dualities, ambition and restraint, order and dissatisfaction, observation and secrecy, were quietly forming, shaping a man who could appear ordinary to the world while harboring deeply private and unexpressed desires. Before we continue, remember, understanding a person's upbringing and personality traits does not excuse violent actions. Awareness of patterns, warning signs, and behavioral tendencies is crucial in preventing tragedy. Early intervention and support can make the difference between potential and destruction. By the end of his young adult years, Chris Watts had built a life of discipline, technical skill, and emotional reserve. He moved with care, acted with precision, and presented an image of normalcy that earned him respect and trust. Yet beneath this carefully constructed exterior lay the seeds of isolation, compartmentalization, and a capacity for rationalizing self-interest over empathy. These traits, while unnoticed by most, would later collide with relationships, stress, and temptation, setting the stage for the darkest chapter of his life. By the time Chris Watts reached his mid-20s, the patterns of his youth had solidified into a carefully constructed adulthood. He had left the familiarity of North Carolina behind and entered a world defined by structure, routine, and measured ambition. His technical skills, honed over years of trade school and automotive work, opened doors in the oil industry, a field demanding precision, stamina, and unwavering attention to detail. Eventually, he found a place at Anadarko Petroleum, where he could work long hours with steady pay, immersing himself in a world of machinery, schedules, and controlled outcomes. In this environment, Chris thrived. He was reliable, competent, and unassuming, earning the respect of his coworkers while maintaining the emotional distance that had always defined him. Yet, beneath this surface, there was restlessness. Chris had mastered the art of outward calm, of presenting a composed, responsible facade, but internally, he carried dissatisfaction. Friends and colleagues described him as private, measured, and careful, someone who did not reveal his inner thoughts easily. His emotional reserve was not merely a habit. It was a shield, a way to manage his life, control perception, and guard himself from vulnerability. It was in this controlled space that his desire for something different, something more liberating than routine, began to take root. Relationships, too, reflected this duality. Chris dated casually, but no connection seemed to penetrate the layers of self-protection he had built over decades. He was polite, attentive, and steady, the kind of man many trusted. Yet he remained distant, holding back emotional intimacy and rarely revealing his deeper desires or dissatisfaction. He sought a partner who could both complement his reserved nature and fit into the careful life he had constructed. Someone whose energy and ambition would not disrupt his controlled world, but could inspire it in measured ways. Financial stability was both a priority and a source of pressure. Chris understood the demands of adult life: mortgages, bills, taxes, and insurance. He was pragmatic, deliberate, and cautious, balancing ambition with the practical realities of maintaining independence. Even as he earned a steady paycheck, he monitored expenses meticulously, avoiding unnecessary risks and building the scaffolding of the life he envisioned. Yet, that same pragmatic drive also nurtured subtle frustrations, the sense that obligations constrained him, that he was tethered to responsibilities he had not fully chosen. It was during this period, still young, still private, that Chris Watts' personality began to intersect with the circumstances that would later define his life. Psychologists examining his early adulthood point to a dangerous combination: emotional detachment, compartmentalization, and a capacity for self-centered rationalization. These traits allowed him to maintain the image of a devoted son, diligent worker, and polite peer while hiding a growing sense of frustration and unfulfilled desire. In essence, he had become a man who could live in two worlds simultaneously: the orderly exterior and the private interior, each unaware to outsiders of the other. The relationships that followed carried the same undercurrent of duality. When he met Shanann, the dynamic shifted. Shanann was vibrant, assertive, and determined, with goals and ambitions that contrasted sharply with Chris' quiet, controlled demeanor. To him, she was both a challenge and a compliment. a woman whose energy could energize him, but whose demands also pressed against the structures he had long relied upon. Their courtship and early marriage were infused with this tension, affection and partnership, but also subtle frustration and growing internal conflict. He began to navigate not only the challenges of maintaining a household, but also the hidden pressures of desire, temptation, and longing for autonomy. The pattern of emotional compartmentalization intensified. Chris Watts had always internalized his frustrations, but now he began to develop secretive strategies for coping. Private fantasies emerged, moments of escape that allowed him to imagine a life unburdened by obligations. These fantasies were not idle daydreams. They were detailed and deliberate, forming a psychological blueprint for a future in which he could reclaim the freedom he felt had been lost. Psychologists reviewing the case later described this as an early form of rationalization, a dangerous interplay between desire, control, and suppressed anger that would later fuel his decisions. Even as he maintained his external persona, a dependable employee, a polite husband, a dutiful family man, Chris Watts began to explore behaviors that would ultimately intersect with these fantasies. Friendships remained limited but loyal, with few people noticing his increasing desire to escape the constraints of his life. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, even admirable, reliable, technically capable, and socially competent. But the truth was far more complex. He was crafting, consciously or unconsciously, the mental framework that would allow him to justify actions no one could have imagined. By now, he was already operating in a dual reality, the life he lived and the life he imagined. This duality was crucial. It allowed him to plan, strategize, and compartmentalize emotional conflict without alerting those around him. Experts would later point out that this is a common trait among individuals who commit premeditated acts of violence. The ability to simulate normalcy while internally rehearsing behaviors and outcomes that remain hidden. Chris Watts' life before Shanann, seemingly mundane, was actually a complex interplay of outward conformity and inward calculation, desire and restraint, imagination and detachment. Recognizing warning signs in yourself or someone you know, emotional detachment, secrecy, compartmentalization, or rationalizing harmful fantasies, is crucial. Seeking counseling or intervention can prevent tragedy before it escalates. By the time Shanann entered the picture fully, Chris Watts had become a man fully capable of maintaining appearances, compartmentalizing desire, and rationalizing frustration. His technical skills, calm demeanor, and methodical approach to life masked a psychological architecture capable of harboring dangerous intentions. The life he had built, precise, orderly, and externally normal, would soon collide with desire, temptation, and opportunity, setting the stage for events that would shock a nation. As Chris Watts entered his late 20s, the life he meticulously constructed began to reveal the deeper architecture of his mind. He was, to all appearances, a man of routine, precision, and calm, the dependable son, the competent employee, the husband who attended to responsibilities with unwavering care. Yet beneath this surface, an intricate network of desire, detachment, and rationalization had taken root. The man who could calculate, compartmentalize, and perform flawlessly in the eyes of others was also capable of envisioning a life unburdened by the constraints of responsibility, a life shaped by his private wishes and unspoken frustrations. Psychologists examining his case have noted that Chris Watts' emotional detachment was a key factor in his internal world. He had learned to separate his outward persona from his internal thoughts, to simulate empathy when necessary, and to suppress or redirect emotional responses that might interfere with his carefully structured life. When colleagues, friends, or family interacted with him, they saw calm, politeness, and reliability. They did not see the quiet calculations, the compartmentalized anger, or the private fantasies that would later inform his decisions. In essence, Chris Watts had become a man living in two realities simultaneously, one public, one private, both carefully managed, both deeply influential. Rationalization became a cornerstone of his internal psychology. Small frustrations, unmet desires, or disagreements were absorbed, analyzed, and internalized. Over time, These accumulated into a perception that his life was constrained, that he had been deprived of choice or autonomy. This perception, combined with an ability to detach from emotion and consequences, created fertile ground for dangerous thought patterns. Experts later described these tendencies as characteristic of narcissistic and psychopathic traits: a focus on self-interest, a capacity for manipulation, and the ability to envision outcomes without full moral consideration. In relationships, this duality became even more pronounced. With Shanann, Chris maintained the exterior of a loving husband while privately experiencing mounting frustration and resentment. Psychologists suggest that in such situations, individuals often engage in emotional compartmentalization, keeping private desires, grievances, or fantasies strictly separate from public life. For Chris, this meant that he could envision escape, freedom, or a life with someone else while still performing the duties of a husband and father. A psychological maneuver that allowed him to plan, rationalize, and anticipate consequences without being fully present in the emotional reality of those he loved. The fantasies that had begun in private now took on new urgency. The prospect of an affair, a new life, or the possibility of unburdened independence became increasingly compelling. Chris described in later notes and interviews a sense of inevitability, a belief that circumstances had left him with no alternative. Experts analyzing his behavior argue that this is a hallmark of individuals with a dangerous combination of narcissism and emotional detachment. The belief that personal desires justify actions that would otherwise be morally unacceptable. In Chris Watts' case, this translated into a chilling calculus, a mental rehearsal of outcomes that would later be executed in reality. Anger and frustration, though contained and private, also played a pivotal role. Chris perceived his life as constrained by obligations he had not fully chosen: a household, financial pressures, and marital expectations. While these pressures were real, his response was not one of impulsive outburst. It was methodical, premeditated, and calculated. In his mind, he rationalized that the only path to freedom was to remove the sources of constraint entirely. Psychologists note that this interplay of suppressed rage, rationalization, and compartmentalization is a pattern often observed in cases of premeditated familial homicide, an internal logic that justifies extreme action while maintaining outward normalcy. Even empathy, when expressed, was strategically deployed. Chris could project concern, simulate grief, or display vulnerability, but always when it served his narrative. These outward displays were not necessarily genuine. They were tools carefully employed to manage perception, maintain trust, or manipulate outcomes. Experts call this instrumentalized empathy, the ability to mirror emotions convincingly without truly internalizing them. In practical terms, it meant that Chris could maintain relationships, perform his duties, and appear compassionate, all while harboring intentions and desires that were hidden from everyone around him. By the time Chris Watts' secret life intersected with opportunity, the presence of a new romantic partner, the pressures of family obligations, and the psychological architecture he had been building for decades, the stage was set. The man who had been disciplined, reliable, and outwardly ordinary became capable of conceiving, rationalizing, and ultimately executing acts of unspeakable violence. His early life, with its emphasis on observation, control, and restraint, had prepared him for a dual existence, one of public normalcy, one of private planning. The collision of these realities would prove fatal. Experts analyzing his psyche conclude that Chris Watts' case is not merely an example of impulsive rage or domestic conflict. It is a study in how emotional detachment, narcissistic fantasy, compartmentalization, and instrumentalized empathy can intersect to produce catastrophic outcomes. His mind had been shaped by decades of subtle emotional dynamics, reinforced by skill, discipline, and calculated restraint. When combined with opportunity and temptation, it created a psychological storm capable of destroying the very people closest to him. His life before the tragedy, then, is not simply a prelude. It is an essential lens for understanding the human capacity for hidden cruelty. It illustrates how ordinary-seeming people can harbor extraordinary danger, how quiet detachment and compartmentalized desire can evolve into deliberate, premeditated violence. Chris Watts' story challenges us to examine the warning signs, the internal pressures, and the psychological structures that, if unaddressed, can escalate into unthinkable acts. If you or someone you know struggles with emotional detachment, controlling behavior, or suppressed anger that could escalate to harm, seek help immediately. Counseling, therapy, and early intervention are vital. Recognizing dangerous patterns and addressing them early can prevent tragedy and protect vulnerable lives. Chris Watts' case is a chilling reminder. Danger does not always announce itself with shouting or chaos. Sometimes it lives quietly, invisibly, behind a mask of normalcy, waiting for circumstances that allow private desire and calculation to collide with opportunity in the most tragic of ways.